introduce our very special guests today, Dr. Andrew Whitehead and Dr. Samuel Perry, authors of the awesome book, Taking America Back for God.
The way that we define Christian nationalism in the book is that it's a cultural framework. It's like a lens through which people see and interpret their social worlds, and it's tied to this underlying desire to see this version of Christianity privileged in the public sphere, have power over and above any other type of religion or non-religion.
Sam, do you want to add to that at all? It's an identity in a way.
Yes, for sure. So I think it relates to personal identity in a way that is very close to like an ethnic identity. Not only is it a cultural framework that shapes our values and beliefs and the way we see the world, but it provides this powerful identity. Who is us, and what should our nation be prioritizing and practicing?
Many Americans who strongly embrace Christian nationalism are religious, and they go to church a lot. But once we account for somebody's level of Christian nationalism, how strongly they embrace this and how much they kind of identify with this kind of personal identity of who we are and what we're all about. People that are low on Christian nationalism, if they attend church a lot, they tend to be more pro-social. They'll be more welcoming to immigrants or refugees. They'll be more open to common sense gun laws. Whereas if they're very high on Christian nationalism and embrace it really strongly, they tend to be much more opposed to gun control.
We want to communicate to religious Americans that this doesn't have to be you we're talking about. We get that question a lot. Hey, I'm religious. I think being a Christian is important to me. It's an important part of my identity. I want to vote my values and those kinds of things. We got no problem with that. Be religious, but be religious in a way that is welcoming and tolerant and embraces democracy for all and not just a few. Historically, Christian nationalism has always been it's always been an element of certain American populations that wanted to tie national and racial membership with Christian membership and all of these things. There is the strong perception among white cultural conservatives, everything's being taken from us and we want to take that back, hence the title of the book.
You have who we call accommodators, Americans who will say, Christianity played an important role in our history. It can do good things in society now. They don't necessarily think that it should be privileged over and above all others, but they think that it should play a role. So they're accommodating of this idea of Christianity playing a big role in the U.S.
We've talked about how Christian nationalism is an identity. How much of that is about a white identity?
We have found African Americans often embrace a form of this Christian nationalism, but it behaves almost completely different from the way it does among white Americans who affirm the same questions. And primarily, that is because for white Americans who think about Christianity and wanting to see Christianity institutionalized in the public sphere, they think a white version of that Christianity, it's racialized. For African Americans, if they affirm those same questions, they're not envisioning a history where their group has been in power. What they tend to be apparently affirming when they affirm those questions about how the nation should advocate for Christian values or how religious symbols would be okay in public spaces, they're really thinking about a nation that has never lived up to its professing Christian identity. It ends up making them more progressive in a lot of ways, whereas for white Americans, it seems to make them want to double down on authoritarian control, on xenophobia. We have found Christian nationalism is particularly pernicious among white Americans because of all that it means for them culturally.
Whites in power saying that this is a Christian nation, enslaving or pushing Native Americans off of land, using those things to say this is why we should. And that has a history, and that history has residue that is still with us today. When people use those terms, it's a part of that history. It can't just be separated.
And you've done some fascinating work as things are changing. I mean, the Mississippi just voted to remove the Confederate symbol from their flag, but they also voted at the same time that they have to have "In God We Trust" on it. And you've shown with your research that that phrase is this Christian nationalist dog whistle.
Right. So they removed one explicitly racialized symbol for a more tacitly racialized symbol. Still means the same thing. It still means our people, our group that we want to see privileged.
How does Christian nationalism impact people's views about the pandemic?
We were able to collect some data asking our Christian nationalism questions, but also asking questions about how you behaved during the pandemic, whether or not you socially distanced, whether or not you wore a mask. And we found that Christian nationalism, again, was this incredibly powerful predictor. They felt like we ought to preserve liberty. We ought to protect the economy. We ought to, sacrifice the elderly if it meant saving the economy. Unfortunately, again, we found Christian nationalism to be this very strong predictor of some pretty negative attitudes.
Their view of the Constitution being divinely ordained, and so the Second Amendment is from God, the Christian God, saying you have a right to bear arms. And then two, they see even violence isn't going to be reduced by fewer guns. It's only going to be reduced by restoring, as they see, the moral fabric of our nation. So getting people to accept Jesus or to at least become Christian, that's the only way that we're going to take care of violence or gun violence, rather than any sort of federal restrictions on guns.
Being a strong affirmer of Christian nationalism, it's almost a redundancy to say that they are strongly xenophobic and fearful of immigration in all forms, whether that's Mexican Americans or whether that is Muslim Americans, anybody who is not white, brown-skinned, of another religion, even worse.